Do you know anything about Roger Williams?
He did a vaccine, I think. Or was it an invention? I'm sure it wasn't anything bad. Dude, whatever happened to him? Wasn't he like the lead guitarist in some 80s group? I can't remember the name though.
Wasn't he the last man to hit over 400? Am I right?
Yes, he was in the music business. I think he was a songwriter, or was he a comedian?
These people don't know who Roger Williams is.
You and I enjoy great personal freedom. That freedom includes the right to worship as conscience directs, or not to worship at all. Liberty of conscience is protected by the first two clauses of the Constitution's Bill of Rights. In North America, hundreds of different religions live and worship in peace because our government doesn't interfere with religious beliefs and practices. And the reason it doesn't goes back to our earliest beginnings. Among the first Puritans coming to America from England was a man who believed that liberty of conscience, or soul liberty as he called it, was a God-given right. During his lifetime, he was on the cutting edge of the struggle for human rights. He risked his life rather than submit to religious authority. His name? Roger Williams, freedom's forgotten hero. Many of us take freedom of religion for granted, but religious persecution has been part of this planet's history from earliest times. Even today, throughout much of the world, people are oppressed because of their religious beliefs.
Saudi Arabia, 2 Filipinos were sentenced to be beheaded for being Christians. Indonesia, Muslim youth set fire to churches, then killed and mutilated Christians. Burma, the Buddhist government did nothing to stop rioters from attacking mosques and Muslim-owned shops. Muslims were told to convert to Buddhism or leave the country. Mexico, a Presbyterian lay preacher was gunned down after months of harassment by local officials. Some towns have posted signs saying, "Protestants prohibited, this village is Catholic." Northern Ireland, 3 Catholic brothers, ages 10 and younger, were killed in connection with a firebombing, continuing a long history of intolerance between Protestants and Catholics. France, 2 laws have been adopted which punish more than 170 minority religions, with a 60% tax on contributions to these churches. Similar stories of persecution come to us from India, China, Tibet, Pakistan, and Egypt. In Turkey, an elected member of a pro-Islamic party was banned from her seat in the Turkish parliament and stripped of her Turkish citizenship because she arrived for duty wearing the symbolic Islamic headscarf.
Would I have the same freedom to practice my faith in Turkey? Answer is no. A Turkish woman who wants to practice her faith to cover her hair in Turkey cannot do so. But American Turkish woman certainly will have the freedom to practice her faith in the United States.
In our country, literally hundreds of different religions, covering the entire spectrum of beliefs, live and worship in peace.
Historians call it the Great Migration. 3.5 centuries ago, hundreds of tiny wooden ships set sail from the troubled island kingdom of England and headed westward for the New World. Tossed for months on the angry Atlantic, they landed on these rocky shores of New England, and they thanked God. The settlers were English Protestants called Puritans. They saw themselves on an errand to purify England's dominant church and create what they called a model of Christian charity, an example for the entire world. The Puritans assumed that civil rulers had a God-given obligation to work hand in glove with ministers and deacons to ensure success by enforcing religious uniformity. In early New England, church and state were united. Roger Williams was a Puritan. He arrived in Massachusetts on February 5, 1631. But unlike other Puritans, he challenged the right of anybody, kings, judges, priests, or ministers, to enforce religious beliefs. He believed there was a hedge or wall separating church and state.
Neither the church nor the government satisfied him. The church was not pure enough. It maintained too cozy a relationship with the Church of England. As for the government, Williams believed it had no authority to supervise man's duties to God.
Williams' thinking did not make him popular during his lifetime, but his ideas eventually entered the American bloodstream. It is partly because of Williams that today, policemen, judges, and soldiers are forbidden to force Americans to accept or reject any religious beliefs. To understand Roger Williams and his ideas, which were shocking to the leaders of his day, an understanding of the Europe from which the Puritans escaped is necessary. Early in the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine formed a church-state union to maintain civil peace. For the next 1,200 years, the Roman Catholic Church, in combination with civil authorities, ruled Western Europe. Civil and religious dissent was routinely humbled and crushed. Freedom of conscience was not tolerated.
Nor did tolerance for religious dissent increase during the Protestant Reformation. The 16th and 17th centuries were turbulent and bloody. Europe was rocked by religious persecution. Catholics and Protestants killed each other, and Protestants killed other Protestants, all in the name of Christ. Sebastian Castillo was a victim of this madness. Hunted by both Catholics and Protestants, Castillo asked, was all this bloodshed really from God? If so, what had been left for the devil?
This was the world into which Roger Williams was born. It was a time in which twin concepts regarding church-state relations were held to be essential. One was the belief that whoever had the power to rule the nation also had the power to determine its religion. The second was the concept that the survival of the state depended upon uniformity in religious beliefs and practices. Within this structure, there was no room for freedom of religious thought. More than a century passed before a national government was established that respected the individual conscience.
In England during this time, religious persecution ran rampant. Each change of the monarchy was marked by a bloody change in religious power.
Henry switching from Rome to something else, Anglican. Edward, let us say, becoming much more rigidly Protestant. Mary, back to Rome. Elizabeth, away. That leads Williams to say, it has been England's shame to change her religions as lightly as she changes her clothing.
Queen Elizabeth reestablished Protestantism. She believed that she could achieve unity by creating a national church that was just Catholic enough for Catholics and Protestant enough for Protestants.
Neither Catholics nor Puritans accepted Elizabeth's vision for the Church of England. The papacy, calling her an incestuous bastard, excommunicated her and promised forgiveness of sins to all who should aid in deposing the Queen. Papal support of the Spanish Armada, which was defeated in 1588, resulted in increased persecution of Catholics. 61 priests and 49 laymen were executed between 1588 and 1603. However, during this same period, An even greater number of Puritans felt the Queen's deadly wrath.
In 1603, Elizabeth I died. James I ascended the throne. It was about this time that Roger Williams was born. Both English Catholics and Puritans looked forward to the crowning of James I, sometimes called a Prince of Great Hope. Catholics anticipated that James would loosen restrictions on practicing their faith. Puritans envisioned the new king purifying the Church of England. Both were disappointed.
By 1605, it became clear that Catholics were not about to receive any new religious freedoms. Therefore, a group of Catholics conspired to blow up the king and Parliament. The conspirators were executed as traitors usually were. They were hanged until groggy, then staked out, and their bodies dismembered while they were still alive. The severity of the punishment was in direct proportion to the severity of the crime. Their acts were treasonous both to the state and the church.
Meanwhile, outside of authorizing the publication of the King James Version of the Bible, King James ignored the Puritans unless they spoke of separating from the Church of England, an act of treason itself. Prevailing thought held that uniformity of religion was necessary to the survival of both church and state.
Most Puritans had no desire to separate from the Church of England. Their mission was to purify the church, not to split it asunder. And for the most part, James left them undisturbed. But in his last years, tolerance of Puritans decreased. With the ascension of King Charles I, church-state leadership passed to him, and after 1628, William Laud, Bishop of London, joined Charles as his religious advisor. By this time, a kinder, gentler form of persuasion, the cropping of ears and the boring of tongues, had replaced religious executions.
Hopes of purifying the church vanished. The Puritans' way became as hard as stone and their future dark. The land had grown weary of its inhabitants, and significant numbers determined to leave. A new colony would be planted on the shores of North America, and a purified Church of England would be created. This was the church-state scene during Roger Williams' formative years. In all probability, Roger Williams was born of middle-class parents in London in 1603, the year that James I ascended the throne. He grew up in Newgate, a suburb of London, and attended St. Sepulchre's Church, an Anglican parish. At about 10 years of age, Williams went through a conversion experience that he describes as the Father of lights and mercies touching my soul. From that time on, his life was centered on seeking God's will. During his teens, Williams' life took an upward turn when he obtained a position as clerk for Sir Cook, England's leading jurist. This connection led to Williams being admitted to Pembroke College of Cambridge University. After graduating in 1627, Williams did graduate work until he accepted Anglican employment. He assumed the post of private chaplain to Sir William Masham, a leading Puritan. By 1630, Williams had married. Because religious intolerance had increased, he decided to cast his lot in North America. He landed in Boston in February of 1631, joining his fellow Puritans who had arrived 8 months earlier. New Canaan now had its own dissenter, a dissenter it had not anticipated.
Roger Williams arrived to find a very primitive Puritan community. It had been in existence only for a matter of months. And the Puritan Commonwealth, as it developed, desired to keep church and state working closely together. For example, the civil magistrate enforced religious duties as well as civic duties.
The Puritans believed government was to enforce the biblical 10 Commandments, which had been carved on 2 tables of stone. The first outlining man's duties to God, the second listing man's duties to each other. Under this system, blasphemy and swearing were punished, and the Sabbath was strictly enforced. Additionally, the state was to stifle any philosophical deviation from Puritan ideals.
Roger Williams challenged all of this. It was not long before he was considered dangerous.
Well, that's what Massachusetts Bay General Court said. New and dangerous opinions. Of course, by definition, a new opinion is often a dangerous opinion. But yes, from their point of view, he clearly was dangerous. He challenged the legitimacy of their charter. He said they occupied the land as trespassers because they hadn't bought it from the Indians. He was a threat to their civil structure because he thought the civil magistrates should have absolutely nothing to do with religion.
Within days of landing, Williams was offered the pastorship of the Boston Church. Believing its members continued to be tied too closely to the Church of England, Williams refused the position.
And he challenged them boldly, directly, that they needed to come out and separate from the Church of England. They wanted to separate in the sense of creating a new and better church, but they still wanted to consider themselves part of the Church of England. Roger Williams said, "You can't do it. That's hypocritical, dishonest, impossible."
He clearly was put off by the Massachusetts Bay establishment. The establishment there meant several things. First of all, it meant that the Congregational Church had a monopoly on worship. They were the only church. If you wanted to worship, you had to worship in the Congregational Church. In fact, you were required to show up at the church services in the Congregational churches. It also meant that you were taxed no matter what your religious belief, and those taxes went to fund the Congregational Church.
Roger Williams wanted to separate church and state to protect religion.
Roger Williams also was very interested in protecting the state from the church. For example, he thought it was entirely inappropriate that civil office holding in Massachusetts should be reserved only for church members. He thought that the state was cheating itself of real talent.
Devoutly religious and spiritual, Roger Williams was not a secular humanist. His arguments were based on the Bible and derived from his fervent belief in God. He passionately believed that church and state should not be mixed.
You know, it's Roger Williams that invents this metaphor of the high wall. In fact, he talked about a high wall, the hedge between the garden of Christ and the world, the wilderness of the world. He said there aren't any Christian nations. There's no such thing as a Christian nation. He believed the state was based ultimately upon the power of the sword to strike people and make them do what they want to do. On the other hand, he believed the church was based upon the love of God. And when you mix those two things, you corrupt this church.
Roger Williams was, I'm sure we would all agree, America's first church-state separationist, which is interesting because in many circles today, the word separationist is sort of a dirty word. But it's important to remember that contrary to what many would have us believe today, the separation of church and state is not something strictly for atheists or for secular humanists. Indeed, Roger Williams, the first church-state separationist in this country, was far from that.
Williams is a man who's concerned about pure religion.
I don't remember what historian said it, but described him as a God-intoxicated man.
Roger Williams had strong religious beliefs and convictions. He believed the Pope was Antichrist. He so strongly disagreed with the Quakers that at the age of 70, he rowed a boat 35 to 40 miles from Providence to Newport to debate them. But no matter how much he might disagree with their theology, people of all religious persuasions were allowed to live freely in Rhode Island. Here, freedom of conscience was not restricted to Christians. It also applied to Native Americans.
He was quite struck by the fact that the Indians oftentimes were more noble and Christian than were the so-called Christians. He said that on a number of occasions. He also, of course, made the effort to learn the languages, which is unlike almost everybody else. And that benefited everybody, the fact he could talk to all these people. And he actually ended up writing a dictionary, which I believe is the first dictionary of an Indian language in English.
His efforts to convert Native Americans to Christianity differed from the conventional methods of his time. He refused to participate in what he called an anti-Christian conversion. He was a different kind of missionary.
But a very particular kind of missionary. He was quite leery of what he regarded as forced conversion, and therefore did not enlist great numbers of Indians in the Christian cause. He continued to preach to them until very near the end of his life, as a matter of fact. But he was not counting numbers and not tallying and not saying, did you say your prayers today? Have I baptized you yet?
Williams had a persuasive personality. He threatened the entire Puritan enterprise. Williams declared that the king could not give Native Americans land away. He spoke out against the judicial practice of requiring witnesses to tell the truth with the words, "So help me God." He believed civil government had no right to enforce church attendance or punish Sabbath breaking. One's duty to God was not an enforceable civil power. His challenge ran counter to the principles of the Puritans' New Canaan and their marriage of church and state. The civil magistrates were not God's own deputies. William Bradford, Plymouth's governor, described him in this way.
Williams was a godly man and zealous, having many precious parts. However, on occasion, the zeal outmatched the godliness, and he began to fall into some strange opinions, and from opinions to practice, which caused some controversy between the church and him.
Williams was a dynamic preacher. On one occasion, he stated that the red cross on the British flag was a popish symbol. In response, his good friend and supporter John Endicott desecrated the flag by cutting out the offending cross. "1635 was a year of trials. At various times throughout the year, Williams appeared before the Massachusetts Bay General Court, unsuccessfully defending his positions on religious and legal grounds. In October, the court ruled that Williams be banished from the colony and given 6 weeks to set his affairs in order. Later, it was decided not to execute the punishment until spring, provided Williams kept still, an impossibility. In January, the court secretly determined to send Williams immediately back to England. However, word leaked out. 3 days before the authorities arrived at his home, he vanished into the winter wilderness.
God makes a path, provides a...
In January 1636, in bitter winter, exposed to the mercy of a howling wilderness of frost and snow, Roger Williams set out on foot, leaving his family and home in Salem. Throwing himself on the mercy of Native Americans for 14 weeks, he knew not from where bread or bed would come. Yet in the midst of much suffering, his religious conviction remained unchanged. Concerning this precarious time, he penned these words.
Lost man, your time I have had, no guide, no house, but a low tree. In him I have found a house, a bed, a table, company. No cup so bitter, but made sweet when God shall sweetening be.
In the spring of 1636, Williams arrived at the headwaters of Narragansett Bay. Here, he decided to stop. He purchased land from the Native Americans and established his village. He named it Providence in recognition of what he viewed as God's merciful providence to him in his distress. Here, he erected the wall between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. The laws of Providence extended only to civil things. Providence held forth liberty of conscience. The spirit of Roger Williams was engraved on the bell of the First Baptist Church of America in 1775. For freedom of conscience, the town was first planted. Persuasion, not force, was used by the people. This church is the oldest and has not recanted, enjoying the granting bell, temple, and steeple. The founding of Rhode Island did not end Williams' controversy with Massachusetts Bay Colony. Over the next several years, a dynamic and often heated discussion of church-state relations took place between Williams and John Cotton. John Cotton, who arrived in the Puritans' New Canaan 2 years after Roger Williams, became one of Roger Williams' major antagonists.
Cotton had been an Anglican minister who cleverly escaped the wrath of the officials in England, even though he conducted services in the Puritan style. In 1630, he gave a dockside farewell service for the main body of Puritans leaving for the New World. He declared that they were doing God's will and that their enterprise would succeed, but Cotton stayed behind. Then in 1633, when William Laud, now Archbishop of Canterbury, summoned him, Cotton fled to the New World rather than appear before him.
As pastor of the Boston Church, John Cotton became the leading Puritan intellect and shining star of New England. Though himself a victim of oppression in England, Cotton advocated using the power of the state to persecute heretics. He became one of the primary forces behind the banishment of Roger Williams from Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Cotton's opinion was the prevailing opinion of the day. Both church and state depended on religious uniformity. Therefore, a close partnership between the civil magistrate and clergy needed to be maintained.
Roger Williams was a radical. His views on a broad range of subjects, differing dramatically from those of Cotton, were considered new and dangerous. Their ongoing dialogue marks the first time two intellects directly tangled over the issue of proper church-state relationships, issues very much alive today. This battle was carried on by way of letters and printed materials, with John Cotton firing the first shot.
The fundamental task of the state is the establishment of pure religion and the reformation of corrupted religion.
But the magistrate has no power to enforce religious demands. The laws of the first table of the Ten Commandments are not regulations of a civil society or political order. They belong to the realm of religion, not of politics.
But I say the civil sword may be used against Christians embracing false doctrines, which corrupt others, or are in danger of doing so. Survival depends upon this right.
Oh, but when God's people open a gap in the hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, the garden becomes a wilderness.
Roger Williams employed the garden metaphor as a way of emphasizing the purity of the church. And if you do not keep a hedge or a wall between the church and the world, then the weeds of the wilderness invade the garden of Christ's church. If the children of God are found to walk in the way of the wicked, their brethren may justly afflict them for it, to deprive them in some cases not only of the common air of the country by banishment, but even the common air of the world by death itself.
Indeed. Books written on behalf of peace and liberty are written in milk, while books proposing conformity and persecution are written in blood. We must prevent the deflowering of chaste souls and the spilling of the blood of the innocent. Demanding what a man believes is like requiring an unwilling spouse to enter a forced bed. Even the Indians abhor that.
Roger Williams used the term rape to describe what in his view was the grossest violation possible of the soul. That one be forced against his conscience, against his or her will, to an act of faith that was not voluntary and not sincere. This is spiritual rape, in sharp contrast to the liberty of the soul for which William stood.
I think it's lawful to persecute a heretic with the civil sword if he sins against the very light of his own conscience.
Having suggested that religious heretics deserve death, Cotton explained his very narrow view of liberty of conscience.
Liberty of conscience is for those who truly fear the Lord.
But who is to decide who truly fears the Lord? To deny liberty to all non-Christians is to confound both heaven and earth.
A Christian, by departing from God, may disturb the civil state. And it is for the governors of the state to punish him by civil censure.
No, the sword may make a whole nation hypocrites, but it cannot bring one single soul in genuine conversion to Christ. Are we not all obliged to listen to the fearful cries of many thousands of men, women, and children, fathers and mothers, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, old and young, high and low, who have been plundered, ravished, famished, slaughtered, and murdered?
John Cotton was not alone in attacking Roger Williams. Roger Williams' views were too radical on both sides of the Atlantic. In England, Robert Bailey, a leading Presbyterian of the Westminster Assembly, objected to Williams' ideas.
Religious toleration is so abhorrent that the very words themselves should not be voiced aloud. Society must choose between order on one hand and religious chaos on the other. If a state were to grant liberty to religious error, it should then, in all consistency, grant liberty to every form of vice or crime.
Thomas Edwards, also of the Westminster Assembly, made a similar sounding statement.
The magistrate's highest and noblest calling is the suppression of heresy and the protection of religion.
In Geneva, Switzerland, the church and state had worked together to punish heresy and enforce godliness. Ministers in Salem, Massachusetts, Roger Williams' former hometown, encouraged him to consider Geneva.
I have considered Geneva, and I confidently deny that the state may assist the church. It may do so only in the sense that it maintains peace and order. The church may assist the state only in the sense that it may cast a blush of civility and morality upon the citizens.
Other opponents used Bible passages to oppose Roger Williams.
Scripture tells us to go out into the highways and hedges and compel them to come in.
Compelling an unregenerate person to attend church to be spiritually fed is like commanding a dead child to suck the breast or a dead man to feast.
The dialogue between Cotton and Williams did not affect any immediate change in Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 1651, 3 Baptist ministers were arrested, imprisoned, beaten, and fined for preaching their faith in a private home. Williams wrote to Governor John Endicott, his former friend and supporter. He paraphrased the words Saul is said to have heard from God on his way to Damascus.
Endicott, Endicott, why huntest thou me? Why imprisonest thou me? Why finest? Why so bloodily whippest? Why wouldest thou hang and burn me?
Sadly, Roger Williams' words fell on deaf ears in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Quakers were whipped, branded, had their ears cut off, and in 1660, 4 of them were hanged, including a woman. During his lifetime, Roger Williams' philosophy of soul liberty was not widely accepted outside of his colony. Rhode Island was scorned in many circles.
Rhode Island was disdainfully called the ungospelized plantation, or the sewer, or the latrine of New England. Everybody who didn't want to be disciplined, orderly, and well-behaved somewhere else could be sent off to Rhode Island.
However, Roger Williams did have some influence on other colonies.
Well, I think we have evidence that the Rhode Island Charter of 1663 entered the bloodstream of colonial America. The next year, New Jersey, having been taken over by the English from the Dutch, adopt a charter in which not exactly the same words, but very similar words are used. 3 or 4 years later, Carolina, and John Locke is involved in that, writes the fundamental charter for Carolina. Similar language is used. This is staggeringly radical language in 1663, and yet within a decade, it feeds into the bloodstream of colonial America.
Roger Williams traveled his own path, and he often traveled it alone. In Roger Williams' final days, no particular respect was shown him, and no particular notice was taken of his death on an unknown date in 1682. In contrast to the loneliness surrounding Roger Williams' death, John Cotton's final days were marked with a constant crush of visitors. They paid their last respects to the one they considered to be New England's most outstanding theologian. In 1652, he preceded Williams in death.
When John Cotton died in 1652, if you had taken a vote in the American colonies as to whether Cotton or Williams were right, my guess is that John Cotton would have won by a ratio of 10 to 1. Remember, Pennsylvania had not yet been founded for another 30 years. But now, 350 years later, if you take that vote, Roger Williams will win over Cotton by a proportion of 100 to 1 or more.
As time went by, the memory of Roger Williams and his radical ideas regarding liberty of conscience was lost. However, years later, the great philosophers John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison championed the cause of liberty of conscience. During the American Revolution, 2 Baptist ministers, John Leland and Isaac Backus, resurrected from oblivion the memory of Roger Williams and his conviction of soul liberty. And thus, the ideals of Roger Williams became the model of a new nation. Virginia enacted a statute of religious liberty, protecting liberty of conscience. The U.S. Constitution, by not establishing a national church, created history. The religious clauses of the Bill of Rights fulfilled Roger Williams' dream by recognizing free exercise of religion as a fundamental freedom and not something merely tolerated by the majority. In Massachusetts, John Cotton won the battle, but in the United States, Roger Williams won the war.
Recently in Bristol, Rhode Island, the unveiling of a bronze statue drew a diverse crowd of students, university professors, and special guests. It was not John Cotton who was honored, but Roger Williams at a university named in his honor. Dr. Joan Brown Campbell, in her address to the distinguished crowd, expressed the sentiments of many as she attempted to summarize the impact of Roger Williams.
Williams had the vision of a Galileo, of a Moses, of a Martin Luther King, the wisdom to see something most people cannot see or will not see, and the courage, perhaps the obstinance, perhaps the difficult personality to press on, to be sure you're right when everyone tells you you're wrong. Today, we're happy beneficiaries of this lively experiment. The people of the United States have adopted the Rhode Island model and made it their own, first in Virginia, then in the First Amendment. The vision of Roger Williams has come to full flower. This full-throated freedom of conscience is America's greatest gift to humankind. We learn from Roger Williams that coerced religion on its good days, produces hypocrites, and on its bad days, rivers of blood. He was convinced that the best thing that the government could do for religion was to leave it alone. Williams gave us the term separation of church and state, not the Soviet Constitution, as some have charged, not a secular humanist, as thousands have suggested, not even the great Thomas Jefferson, but a Bible-toting, fire-breathing, rock-ribbed preacher. That's who gave us the separation of church and state, and he did so not out of indifference to religious faith, but precisely because he held religion to be of such great importance. And it is due primarily to this one man, this stubborn, obstinate, obnoxious, unyielding, passionate, compassionate, nervy, respectful, genuine, accommodating giant of a man. This Christian, this Baptist, this seeker, this Roger Williams.